June 7, 1944, just after midnight, beneath a low-hanging fog near Corentin, Normandy. The fields of northern France, still soaked with the blood of D-Day, sat under a haunted stillness. A light drizzle misted down on hedgerows shattered by artillery. In the fading echo of distant thunder, no storm, only war, U.S. soldiers from the 101st Airborne dug in, their breath fogged in the cold night air. Somewhere in the darkness, German patrols moved. But the men felt protected. Between them and the enemy was a weapon they trusted more than almost anything else in the war: the Browning M1919.30 caliber machine gun. Staff Sergeant Michael Colburn wiped the drizzle off the receiver of his M1919A4. Sandbags were stacked tight around the low stone wall of the French farmhouse they'd turned into a defensive position. "She doesn't jam," he told the new kid, Private Lasky, who had just replaced a gunner lost at Utah Beach. "Keep her clean, keep the belt fed, and she'll never let you down." Across the way, obscured behind thick hedgerows and broken fences, German grenadiers with MG-42s lay in wait. The Wehrmacht had spent the past 2 days counterattacking every American foothold they could find. The fighting was brutal, hedgerow to hedgerow, often just a few yards apart. In these conditions, the M1919's steady rate of fire, between 400 and 600 rounds per minute, proved critical. Not as fast as the German MG-42's infamous buzzsaw, but far more controllable. And it didn't overheat as easily. By dawn, the Germans moved. From the orchard beyond the road came the bark of German voices and a sudden, deadly rattle of rifle fire. Mr. Colburn cursed under his breath. "On that line! Now!" He dropped behind the M1919, yanked the bolt, and let loose. The sound tore the morning open. A steady, hammering rhythm, measured, reliable, utterly brutal. Dirt exploded from the orchard floor. The tracers cut straight lines across the mist. Private Lasky shoved a new belt through the feed tray as Colburn adjusted the traverse and continued firing. German troops dove for cover, caught mid-charge, pinned down before they could reach the fence line. That was the power of the M1919, defensive supremacy, suppression, precision. Its recoil was controllable, its tripod steady, and with a trained crew feeding and spotting, it could shut down entire assaults. A German officer, young, maybe 20, tried to rally his men with a whistle. Colburn saw the helmet flash and fired a burst. The whistle went silent. "That's the one they fear," Colburn muttered. It wasn't bravado. After months of combat, the Germans had learned to identify the specific rhythm of the M1919. It wasn't as fast as the MG-42, but it was steadier, and it rarely paused. Wehrmacht troops often reported being pinned by American machine guns that simply refused to fail, even after hours of use. In battle reports, they began referring to it with grudging respect. Some frontline units even gave it nicknames: Stolregen, Steel Rain. Back in the foxhole, Lasky ducked as return fire sprayed the wall behind them. The M1919's barrel began to steam, but Colburn wasn't worried. "We've got air-cooled," he said. "She'll last longer than we will." That was another feature that set the M1919 apart. Air-cooled and built to last, it could fire for extended periods without the need for constant barrel swaps like its German counterpart. When water-cooled variants were deployed, like the M1917, the results were even more staggering. But in the fast-moving fields of France, the air-cooled 1919 was ideal. Mounted on tripods, jeeps, tanks, even planes, it was everywhere. By noon, the German attack had stalled. Bodies lay scattered across the road. Smoke drifted from shattered orchards and splintered trees. The M1919 crew had fired through nearly 1,200 rounds. Lasky's hands were blistered from feeding belts, but the gun still sat solid on its tripod, like a steel heart still beating in the wreckage. Colburn finally stood, stretching his aching back. He didn't smile. He never did after a fight. But he reached down and patted the gun like a soldier pats his dog. "Good girl," he said. 2 days later, that same gun was mounted on a half-track moving north toward Cherbourg. German armor had begun to regroup in the forests beyond St. Miraglisse, and American recon units were sweeping through narrow roads and muddy trails to root them out. In one battered M3 half-track, a mounted M1919 pivoted left and right, searching. Sergeant Hill, manning the weapon, was a veteran of the North African campaign. He had seen how the desert sun could warp weapons and how the M1919 had held up better than most. He'd seen it jam just once, in Tunisia, after it had been dunked in muddy water and fired without cleaning. Even then, it had been back up in under a minute. Now, in the sodden fields of France, he had it mounted high, belt-fed and ready. A flash ahead. Movement in the tree line. Hill called it out, and the half-track halted. German panzer grenadiers opened up, rounds pinging against the armor plating. But Hill's reply came instantly. A long, even burst from the M1919, stitching the hedgerow like a sewing machine from hell. 2 German soldiers fell. The rest ducked and returned fire, but the American firepower overwhelmed them. Infantry dismounted from the half-track and flanked. The machine gun had pinned the enemy just long enough for maneuver, another perfect example of its battlefield role. Further east, across the Atlantic, a very different battlefield demanded the M1919's wrath. In the Pacific, on the jungle-cloaked island of Saipan, Corporal Gene Lee crouched behind a sandbag position, waiting. It was June 17, 1944, 4 days into the battle. The air was thick with smoke, palm leaves smoldered, and the sand was stained black and red. Japanese forces had mounted wave after wave of banzai attacks, screaming, fanatical charges that terrified young American infantrymen. But not the machine gunners. Behind his M1919A6, the lighter, bipod-mounted variant, Gene Lee had learned to trust his weapon. Unlike many of the newer replacements, he understood the importance of discipline. Controlled bursts. No panic. No overheating. The A6 could move with him, but it had to be respected. He kept it clean, oiled, dry as possible. The next banzai wave came just after midnight. Flares burst overhead, illuminating ghost-like figures charging across the sand, bayonets fixed, cries echoing through the jungle. Gene squeezed the trigger. The muzzle flash lit his face with every burst. He fired not in fear, but with rhythm, 3 seconds on, 3 seconds off. The M1919A6 chopped down attackers in rows. Bodies crumpled. The line held. Japanese soldiers flanked left, trying to circle the pillbox next to him, but Gene pivoted the gun, adjusted the legs, and fired again. The bipod dug into the dirt. The barrel smoked. But the weapon never failed. By dawn, over 300 enemy dead lay around the perimeter. The Americans had lost fewer than 30. The M1919 didn't just defend. It spoke. Its sound said, "You will not pass. Not today." Across theaters, from the beaches of Italy to the forests of Belgium, from the atolls of the Pacific to the mountains of Germany, the Browning M1919 was there, mounted in tanks, jeeps, bombers, and in the hands of infantry. It was versatile, dependable, and feared. German commanders learned to plot their attacks around the known presence of American machine gun nests. Japanese commanders warned their troops of the iron storm that tore through every banzai wave. In July of 1944, during Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, The 30th Infantry Division used M1919s to saturate German defences before the advance. In some locations, M1919s laid down covering fire for 20 minutes straight as tanks breached enemy lines. One veteran later wrote, "Our rifles were there to mop up. It was the Brownings that opened the door." And in Bastogne, during the freezing horror of the Battle of the Bulge, when American lines were surrounded and freezing, the sound of M1919s from foxholes echoed through the trees like a heartbeat. Even German paratroopers, elite and aggressive, were held back by machine gun fire that simply didn't stop. By now, the M1919 was more than a tool. It was legend. American gunners took pride in its reliability. Stories spread. One crew had fired 5,000 rounds in one night without a barrel swap and without jamming. Another had recovered an M1919 from a destroyed jeep, cleared mud from its feed tray, and returned it to combat in under 5 minutes. And for every soldier behind the weapon, it was more than specs and stats. It was security. It was justice. It was vengeance. As the war ground on, and the Allies pushed deeper into Axis territory, the M1919 remained constant. As battles changed and tactics evolved, its hammering cadence rang out, across valleys, cities, rice fields, forests, and beaches. It became the voice of the advancing tide. A weapon not designed to shock with speed like the MG-42, but to endure, to suppress, to hold. And in the words of more than one captured German officer, "We did not fear the rifles. We feared the gun that never stopped firing." December 21, 1944, just before sunrise, Bastogne, Belgium, snow falling, boots frozen to the ground. The forest was dead quiet, but not still. Trees creaked under the weight of fresh snow. Steam curled from foxholes carved into frozen earth. American soldiers of the 101st Airborne crouched, shivering, rifles across their laps, scanning the pine thickets for movement. And with them, half buried beneath layers of white and cold canvas, the M1919 machine gun waited, immobile yet awake. Private First Class Charlie Myers huddled behind the weapon with chattering teeth, but steady hands. The barrel was frosted, the tripod legs frozen to the ground, but the internals were greased, dry, and ready. He checked the belt feed again. 21 links left, he whispered to his assistant gunner. Then swap. The Germans were coming. From the mist, from the pine shadows, from foxholes just as cold. Panzer Grenadiers supported by tanks, trying to crush Bastogne and cut off the American defense in the Ardennes. This was the heart of the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble, the greatest surprise attack of the war. But the Americans were dug in. They were low on ammo, food, and medical supplies. And yet, thanks to a wall of steel and determination, they held. And at the very center of that steel wall, the M1919. When the first assault wave emerged from the trees, shadows in white camouflage, rifles low, helmets dusted with frost, Charlie fired. The first burst flashed like a flare, melting snow from the barrel guard. The steady rattle echoed between the trees, bouncing across the frosted woods like a heartbeat. German troops dropped to the snow, caught mid-run. Others scattered into shell holes and behind tree trunks. But they did not advance. The M1919's bark was unmistakable. Not the chaotic buzz of the MG-42, but the cold, rhythmic thump of an American defense line locking into place. Behind the line, the battalion's command post listened to radio chatter. One officer leaned in. "Myers is firing again. That means they've reached the tree line. They didn't need scouts. They had the sound of the Browning. When it roared, the enemy was close. When it stopped, someone had died." In foxholes across the perimeter, other machine gun teams joined in. Interlocking fields of fire. dozens of .30 caliber barrels glowing hot under snow and sleet. Belt after belt fed through greasy hands. Wounded men loaded rounds while others covered with rifles. No one was idle. The Germans couldn't break through. By late morning, smoke hung between the trees like fog. Dozens of bodies lay across the white landscape, black smears staining the snow. A Panther tank burned in the distance, disabled by bazooka fire after it failed to breach the line. The M1919s hadn't just held, they'd bled the assault dry. And this wasn't a fluke. From Anzio to Aachen, from Saipan to Okinawa, this machine gun became the tool of choice for holding ground. Reliable in mud, in snow, in sand, even when surrounded. March 7, 1945, Ludendorff Bridge, Remagen, Germany. American troops had just captured one of the last remaining bridges over the Rhine. A miracle, a strategic gift. The Germans were panicking, calling in artillery, Luftwaffe bombers, and sabotage teams to destroy the span before the US could get armor across. Defending that bridge was chaos. Artillery craters, bomb splinters, and snipers stalked the steel spans and riverbanks. But positioned at both ends, bolted into hastily built bunkers, mounted atop tanks, lined along sandbag nests, were dozens of M1919 machine guns. Sergeant Will Daniels, part of the 9th Armored Division, had his weapon clamped to a jeep parked sideways as cover. Every time a German soldier tried to crawl close with explosives, the Browning spoke first. The gun didn't jam, didn't sputter. It tore holes in every attempt. When Luftwaffe planes strafed the bridge, the AA gunners used .50 calories, but on the ground, the M1919s chewed through advancing infantry trying to rush across the shattered terrain. Daniels would later write in his journal, "We weren't saving a bridge. We were saving the war's ending." And that gun did more for that cause than anything else I had in my hands. By the time Remagen was secure, the American foothold east of the Rhine had begun. Germany's end was now a matter of time. But the Browning story didn't end there. April 1, 1945, Okinawa, Pacific Theater. Marine units landing on Okinawa knew they were entering hell. Japan had fortified every cave, ridge, and slope. Kamikaze attacks swarmed from the skies. Jungle ambushes bled patrols dry. But once more, the M1919 was there. Sergeant Elias Red Connors, a combat vet since Guadalcanal, lugged his M1919A6 up a muddy ridge toward Shuri Castle. It wasn't the heaviest weapon in the Marine arsenal, but it was his most trusted. Slinged on his shoulder, tripod in hand, belt boxes dragging behind him, Red had one goal: dig in, cover the approach, and never let them through. Japanese soldiers launched wave after wave of surprise attacks. From cave openings, tunnel mouths, and spider holes, they charged, screaming, bayonets ready. Red didn't scream. He fired. Each burst cut through the thick Okinawan air. Palm trees shattered. Dirt erupted. Caves collapsed. When his assistant was killed beside him, Red didn't flinch. He kept firing and reloaded alone. When his barrel began to smoke, he switched to controlled bursts. When ammo ran low, he scrounged from nearby casualties and kept the weapon hot. The M1919A6 wasn't designed for assault, but in Red's hands it became a bunker buster, a shield, and a sword. It wasn't until May that Okinawa began to fall. By then, thousands of Marines owed their lives to Red's machine gun and others like it. Weapons that didn't just fire bullets. They ended charges. They held hills. They stopped armies. And in captured Japanese journals and letters, many referred to American machine guns with horror. Some wrote of death thunder, some of the steady weapon that never sleeps. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The war in Europe ended with a roar of celebration. But for many veterans, especially machine gunners, the memories remained sharp, brutal, and sacred. Some men sent their M1919s back to the armory without a second glance. Others, like Sergeant Colburn, stripped the weapon down one last time, oiled every part, and whispered a quiet thanks. Because the Browning M1919 wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol of consistency, of resilience, of American firepower that never blinked. It didn't win the war alone, but it was there, at Normandy, at Bastogne, at Remagen, at Saipan, at Okinawa, reliable, deadly, unstoppable. The Germans called it Respektvol. The Japanese called it Demon Thunder. The Americans? They just called it the gun that always worked. June 6, 1944, 6:35 a.m., Omaha Beach, Normandy. The ramp slammed down, and the world erupted into chaos. Bullets shredded the water before the men even touched sand. Screams, smoke, the bitter slap of surf against bodies and steel. But through the madness, one sound rose steadily above the rest, not German MG-42s echoing from pillboxes, but the defiant reply, the thudding, consistent rhythm of the Browning M1919. Private First Class Eddie Ramirez was waist-deep in the surf, the heavy M1919A4 dragging his shoulder downward. He slipped once, nearly lost it, but he gritted his teeth, held on, and pushed forward toward the shattered beachhead, dragging the tripod like an anchor. Bullets hissed around him. A shell exploded to his left. Water surged over his helmet, but he emerged, crawling, reaching a tangle of tank traps and razor wire. His assistant gunner was gone. No time to check. Eddie set the tripod, loaded the belt, wet, sandy, shaking hands, and returned fire. The M1919 fired. And in that moment, pinned down behind steel X-beams and corpses, the sound gave nearby men courage. Infantry who had once been motionless began crawling forward, emboldened by the steady rattle. Not frantic, not screaming, just there, precise and dependable. The pillboxes were high above, concrete teeth built into the cliffs. The Germans had been preparing this coast for years. But as more American machine guns joined Eddie's, the line began to crawl up the sand. On a nearby tank dozer, a mounted M1919A4 roared from the turret ring, cutting through the slits in bunkers. The dozer was hit, fire and smoke, but not before suppressing the machine gun that had pinned 3 squads for 10 minutes. By 7:30, more guns were ashore, some in sandbags, others rigged to broken jeeps. A few balanced directly on the bodies of fallen comrades, grim, improvised, but unshakable. The Germans fired down in bursts, MG-42s slicing air like saws, but they weren't immortal. When exposed, even briefly, the M1919 caught them. With cleaner lines of fire, better sights, steadier platforms. By 8:15, Sergeant Carson's team had advanced to the first seawall. His 2 M1919s, placed behind shattered debris, raked the ridge lines. The fire wasn't non-stop. The ammo had to be rationed, but every shot counted. The rhythm of those Brownings made it feel, even under that hellish sky, like order was returning. Machine guns didn't win Omaha Beach. But without them, no one would have made it off the sand. July 25, 1944. Operation Cobra, near Saint-Lô, France. Now it was the Americans on the offensive. Columns of Sherman tanks rumbled through hedgerows. Infantry leapfrogged behind them. But ahead of them, in every trench and ambush ditch, waited Waffen-SS machine gunners, concealed under camouflage nets, ready to tear apart the push. Captain Walter Emerson knew what would happen if the line slowed, so he pushed his two M1919s ahead of the rifles. His gunners, Corporal Lee and PFC Hart, moved quickly, bounding from stone walls to hedgerows, setting up, firing controlled bursts. The M1919s weren't light, but they weren't immobile either. With sling setups and handcarts, the gunners could shift, shoot, suppress, and reposition. In one hedgerow ambush, the lead Sherman took a Panzerfaust hit and ground to a halt. Riflemen scattered for cover. The ambushing Germans began flanking, fast and aggressive. But Hart had the Browning up. He braced it against a broken wall, fired 2 long bursts, then repositioned 5 feet to the right and fired again. Lee flanked around, coordinated with a second team, and laid down a crisscross field of fire. The German push died in a withering sheet of .30 caliber. That afternoon, after the smoke cleared and the assault continued, Emerson walked the field. Dozens of German bodies in SS camouflage lay across the fields. Many had their weapons dropped mid-sprint. The only sound now, the steady belt-fed chick-chick-chick as gunners cleaned the M1919s, checked the barrels, and loaded fresh belts for the next attack. September 17, 1944. Operation Market Garden, Netherlands. Paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne dropped into Holland to secure bridges and roads. The Germans, surprised at first, recovered fast. And what followed was a test of endurance. The roads to Arnhem turned into kill zones. German armored cars prowled the outskirts. Snipers infested buildings. And counterattacks came every night. But American airborne held. Because at every crossroad, every canal bridge, every smashed farmhouse window, a Browning M1919 waited. Mounted in attic windows, sandbagged in ditches, braced against overturned furniture. Sergeant Tex Walker of the 101st described his machine gun team as a piano in a war band. When we played, he said, no one dared dance. They held Nijmegen Bridge for 3 straight days, barely sleeping, rotating between barrels and belts. The Germans couldn't believe how often they met resistance where there should have been chaos. That resistance came from the steady click and roar of Browning guns. October 20th, 1944. Leyte, Philippines. Now the gun fought jungle and mud again. When U.S. troops landed at Leyte, the Japanese forces were already entrenched. Snipers in palm trees, mortars in the hills, fanatics in tunnels. But now, American infantry had perfected how to move their firepower. M1919s weren't just static defense anymore. They were part of fire teams. Lighter A6 variants could move with squads. Jungle tripods gave instant setup. And the men carrying them, combat-hardened from Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and New Guinea, knew how to fire in bursts that counted. In one night ambush near Palo, a Japanese banzai charge broke out of the jungle. Dozens of screaming soldiers surged through the underbrush, blades raised, grenades in hand. The Browning didn't flinch. Private Douglas Kimura, a Hawaiian-born gunner with the 24th Division, had been sleeping near his dug in M1919. When the first screams came, he was already behind the gun. 6 belts later, the jungle fell silent again. In the morning, there were no wounded, only bodies, stacked in the mud. The M1919 didn't jam. It didn't overheat. It just stopped the attack, one burst at a time. Late 1944. All theaters. By now, the Germans had learned to fear it. Not just its bite, but what it meant. They'd hear it in the night, short, measured bursts echoing from the hills. They'd hear it on defense, stitched through hedgerows and forests. They'd hear it in retreat, covering fire so precise it seemed mechanical. It was the sound of American resolve, fed through canvas belts, cooled by beryl shrouds, guided by hands that had known loss and knew how to make each round count. The Browning M1919 wasn't sleek. It wasn't modern. But it was relentless. It didn't panic. It didn't overheat. It didn't quit. It was the war's percussion, hammering across two oceans, backing every assault, guarding every withdrawal, giving men like Ramirez, Daniels, Red, and Tex a weapon they could trust. And when they heard it roar, they knew. The line held. December 16, 1944, 5:30 a.m., the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow muffled everything. That was the first thing Sergeant Harold "Red" Mullins noticed as he pulled his collar tighter and leaned over the frozen foxhole. The forest was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Snow clung to pine branches, weighed down the undergrowth, and swallowed sound so completely that even the distant thunder of artillery felt far away. Then the Germans came. They emerged from the trees in grey shapes, moving fast, rifles at the ready, voices barking orders in harsh bursts. This wasn't a probing attack. This was an offensive. A gamble. A last throw of the dice. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Mullins kicked his gunner awake. Up. Now. The M1919 sat wrapped in canvas, its metal already biting cold. The crew stripped it bare with numb fingers, setting the tripod into frozen earth, stamping boots to seat it. Ammunition belts were stiff as boards, links biting into gloves. Across the line, German infantry surged forward behind rolling artillery. Volksgrenadiers mixed with veterans. Panthers growled somewhere beyond the trees. Mullins waited. He'd learned not to fire too soon. When the first Germans broke cover and sprinted across the open snow, he squeezed the trigger. The Browning answered immediately. The sound was different in winter, sharper, flatter, carried low across the ground. The recoil shuddered into his shoulders as tracers cut red lines through white air. Men fell. Others dove. The attack hesitated. And then the Germans brought their own guns up. MG-42s opened in reply, their furious buzz tearing bark from trees and ripping snow into fountains. But the Browning didn't compete on speed. It competed on control. Mullins fired in steady bursts, walking rounds along tree lines, suppressing positions, forcing heads down. The cold should have crippled it. It didn't. Condensation froze on the receiver. The feed pawls stiffened. But the gun kept cycling, round after round, as long as Mullins worked the trigger with discipline. By noon, the forest floor was torn apart. Snow was churned into mud and blood. The German push stalled again and again. Each time they tried to advance, the American machine guns cut lanes of fire they couldn't cross. One captured German later told an interpreter, "Your machine guns never stopped. We thought you had endless men." They didn't. They had Brownings. January 1945. Bastogne perimeter. The Americans were surrounded. Supplies were low. Ammunition rationed. Medics worked in freezing barns. And yet, when German attacks came, they always met the same thing. Crossfires. M1919s positioned at road junctions. M1919s covering forest trails. M1919s firing from ruined houses with barrels poking through shattered walls. Each gun anchored a sector. Each crew knew their arcs by memory. When the Germans tried infiltration tactics, small units slipping through the woods, the Brownings swept likely paths. When armor pushed forward, the guns pinned infantry long enough for bazooka teams to move. And when night fell, the guns stayed manned. No one slept easily. The Germans would probe at dawn, or midnight, or in the grey hours when exhaustion blurred judgment. But every time they heard the same reply, measured, unforgiving bursts that told them the line still held. By the time the skies cleared and Allied aircraft roared overhead, Bastogne was still American, and the M1919s was still firing. March 7, 1945, Remagen, Germany. The bridge was still standing. Smoke curled from the girders. Charges had failed. The Ludendorff Bridge, the last intact crossing over the Rhine, stood like a dare. American engineers ran forward under fire. Infantry followed, and behind them, machine gun crews set up without waiting for orders. M1919s were dragged onto the bridge itself, tripods scraping steel, belts hanging loose over railings. The river churned far below, shells splashed nearby, and German artillery zeroed in from the hills. The Brownings fired straight down the bridge span, suppressing defenders on the far bank. Every German attempt to rush the bridgehead was cut apart. One gun overheated. The crew swapped barrels in seconds. Another gun took shrapnel in the tripod. The gunner fired from the hip until a replacement arrived. The crossing held, and when the bridge finally collapsed days later, it had already done its job. The war had crossed the Rhine. April 1945, the heart of Germany. Cities burned. Factories lay silent. Roads were clogged with refugees, retreating soldiers, and wrecked armor. And everywhere American infantry advanced, the M1919 went with them. In Cologne, a Browning was mounted in a cathedral doorway, firing down a boulevard littered with rubble and wrecked cars. In Leipzig, one covered a street while riflemen cleared apartments floor by floor. In the Harz Mountains, they fired uphill through fog and rain, breaking the last organized resistance of units that no longer believed in victory but fought anyway. German prisoners, when asked what weapon they feared most, often gave the same answer: not tanks, not bombers. The American machine gun, they said. It was always there. May 1945. Europe falls silent. The guns finally cooled. Men leaned on tripods, exhausted, older than they had been a year before. The M1919s was stripped, cleaned, oiled, not because orders demanded it, but because habit did. These guns had been trusted with lives. They had earned respect from enemies and loyalty from those who carried them. August 1945, the Pacific, final months. On Okinawa, the M1919 fired from muddy ridgelines under constant rain. In caves, at tunnel mouths, across shattered coral fields, it ended attacks before they reached American lines. Japanese soldiers, brave and relentless, learned that charges without suppression meant annihilation. And again, the Browning did not jam. It did not quit. It fired until belts ran dry, then waited patiently for the next one. After the war, when the fighting ended, the M1919 didn't vanish. It stayed in armories. It trained new generations. It fought again in Korea. And long after more modern weapons replaced it, veterans remembered its sound, not as noise, but as reassurance. Reliable, deadly, unstoppable, not because it was perfect, but because when everything else failed, it still worked. May 10, 1945, outskirts of Linz, Austria, 2 days after V-Day. The guns had stopped, but the questions had just begun. In a makeshift interrogation tent, American intelligence officers sat across from captured German infantrymen, veterans from the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, many recently surrendered after bitter Alpine resistance. The war was over, but the analysis had only started. Piles of notepads filled with observations, tactics, captured maps, and one repeated remark: Der Amerikanische Maskengewehr, das war tödlich. Zuverlässig. Immer dort. The American machine gun. It was deadly. Reliable. Always there. They weren't talking about the .50 cal M2. They weren't talking about airborne or vehicle-mounted weapons. They meant the M1919 Browning. What made it so respected? It wasn't the fastest. The German MG-42, nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw, fired at 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute, nearly triple the M1919's 400 to 600. German doctrine was built around their machine guns. They were the centerpiece of every squad, and the MG crews were elite. But speed wasn't everything. In countless reports, German officers admitted the M1919 earned their respect for different reasons. Reliability. It fired. In rain, sleet, snow, sand, heat, the M1919 functioned. It was air-cooled, yes, but it handled heat better than expected. It didn't cook off rounds when set up correctly. It was forgiving with dirty belts and rough conditions. In contrast, the MG-34, Germany's original general-purpose machine gun, had an intricate feed system and tight tolerances. In muddy fields or dusty villages, it jammed often. German NCOs observed, the Browning did not fail. You could hear it again and again, without pause. Control. German gunners were trained to use short bursts. The MG-42, while powerful, could waste ammunition rapidly and climb off target under recoil. The M1919, however, delivered manageable, disciplined fire. It could be walked onto targets with precise bursts and used defensively without burning through belts too fast. Your gunners didn't panic, said one captured Oberleutnant. They fired as if they knew exactly what was coming. Steady. Always steady. Deployment. German troops found the M1919 seemingly everywhere, behind hedgerows in Normandy, embedded in rubble in Aachen, peeking from foxholes in Remagen. The Americans' aggressive use of machine guns, often overlapping arcs and well coordinated with rifle squads, gave the illusion of greater firepower than actually existed. A German veteran from the 352nd Division recalled Omaha Beach. We saw small arms, maybe 20 soldiers, and then the Browning started. 2 of our men were cut down before they could reload. We thought there were 5 guns. There was 1. Respect on both sides. In interviews with American machine gunners, some admitted to admiring the MG-42's fire rate, but nearly all of them preferred the M1919 in combat. It was lighter than the MG-42 when tripod-mounted, and easier to maintain. With enough belts, it could dominate a ridge or road for hours. Sergeant Eli James, 30th Infantry Division, remembered a moment outside Nancy, France. We were pinned. Trees snapping, dirt flying. Sounded like 100 MG-42s. I crawled up, set the Browning, and just let it eat. I wasn't trying to kill anyone. I was carving time for our guys to move. But I'll tell you what, after a minute, their guns went quiet, and they never fired from that spot again. Pacific echoes. Japanese soldiers feared it just as deeply. In jungle fights, where ranges were short and visibility worse, the M1919 gave American squads a wall of steel. When Japanese units launched nighttime banzai charges, their doctrine hoped to overwhelm positions with speed and shock. But the M1919 had no fear. It didn't hesitate. Marine Corporal Bill Yamada recalled Okinawa. They came screaming, straight at us. I fired short bursts, then longer ones. I changed barrels once, hands shaking. But the gun never quit. When it was over, my loader cried. I think I did too. Legacy in doctrine. Post-war analyses by both sides highlighted the importance of reliable support weapons. NATO doctrine, built in the early years of the Cold War, emphasized belt-fed machine guns not just for suppression, but as command anchors, something the Browning had proven in World War II. In Korea, the M1919 again anchored outposts during night raids. In Vietnam, its descendant, the M60, carried forward its role. But veterans always said the M1919 felt different. Simpler. Solid. In museums and memory. Today, M1919s rest behind glass. Dusty. Scratched. Many show the wear of hard travel. Sand pitted into receivers, faded serial numbers, discolored barrels from heat and use. But for those who fought with them, or against them, the memories are clear. They were not fancy, said a German POW decades later. But they were always there, always firing. We hated the sound. But we respected it. One last story. April 1945, near Munich. An American machine gun crew set up in a bombed-out farmhouse as SS remnants launched a final counterattack. The gunner, Private Tom Vasquez, was barely 20. His loader was 18. They'd never seen combat before the month prior. But they'd trained well. Their gun, a well-worn M1919 with a taped grip, had survived Normandy and the Bulge. When German troops came down the slope, 5 abreast, Vasquez opened fire. A burst. Another. Then longer. When it was over, 40 men lay sprawled across the hill. The rest vanished into the woods. After the war, one German officer who had survived that final skirmish wrote in a letter during his time as a POW. Your boys did not speak our language. They did not shout. They did not hesitate. Only the gun spoke for them. And it spoke well. June 27, 1950, early morning, just before dawn, near Osan, South Korea. The air was heavy with mist and uncertainty. American soldiers of Task Force Smith, undertrained, under-equipped, and barely prepared, dug shallow positions on a Korean hillside as the sun rose. They had never expected to be the first to fight in a new war. Many had never even heard of the town below them. But one thing was ready. Bipod mounted, cleaned the night before, and resting in its canvas cradle, the M1919A4. The same weapon that had screamed across Normandy and held back banzai charges in the Pacific, now aimed down a dirt road in a different war, against a different enemy. When the North Korean T-34s rolled into view and infantry followed close behind, the M1919 spoke again. It was still deadly, still reliable. Though the task force was eventually overrun, the first U.S. defeat of the Korean War, reports said the Browning machine guns were the only weapons that performed flawlessly. From ridge lines and broken stone walls, they mowed down waves of North Korean troops before finally being silenced, many only when their gunners were killed or overrun. In the years after World War II, the M1919 refused to fade away. It remained the backbone of U.S. machine gun squads throughout the Korean War, from the freezing hills of Chosin to the trenches of the 38th parallel. In brutal night battles and bitter withdrawals, the gun's consistent reliability made it invaluable. Soldiers nicknamed it Old Reliable. Mechanics joked it had more lives than a cat. Commanders relied on it more than radios. When helicopters became the future of mobility, the M1919 was mounted on door rigs. When armored cars rolled into urban centers, it barked from pintle mounts. When tanks transitioned to jet-age designs, the M1919 still guarded commanders' hatches. In Vietnam, it was phased out, but never forgotten. By the early 1960s, the M60 machine gun, inspired in part by German MG designs, replaced the M1919 as the U.S. Army's main general-purpose machine gun. Lighter, faster, and easier to carry in jungle patrols, the M60 promised the future. But in firebases, bunkers, and perimeter defenses, M1919s still showed up. Especially in the early years of the conflict, older units and National Guard armories continued to use the aging Browning. Its solid performance, belt-fed consistency, and battle-tested design made it a quiet workhorse behind sandbags and watchtowers. Even after being replaced, the M1919 trained the next generation. At U.S. military academies, ROTC programs, and basic training centers throughout the 50s and 60s, the M1919 was the standard for machine gun instruction. Future leaders learned barrel change discipline, tripod setup, and sustained fire principles with the same weapon their fathers had fought with in World War II. Around the world, it spread like wildfire. Surplus M1919s flooded global markets. Allied nations received them through military aid. Resistance movements captured them. Revolutionaries mounted them on jeeps, and dictators used them to guard palaces. Israel used M1919s during the War of Independence in 1948 and continued to field them into the 1970s. South Vietnamese troops relied on them to protect outposts against Viet Cong raids. Latin American militaries patrolled jungles with them mounted on trucks. Even in the Falklands War of 1982, British troops reportedly encountered Argentine units using variants of the M1919. Why did it last so long? Because it was simple. Because it worked. Because the rules of war, the need for suppressive, reliable fire, hadn't changed. It was air-cooled, rugged, and powerful enough to defend or attack. With a crew of 2 or 3 and a few belts of ammunition, it could hold a ridge, stop an ambush, or punch through chaos. It wasn't flashy, but it never needed to be. Today, the M1919 lives on, not just in museums, but in memory. On firing ranges across the U.S., reenactors and collectors' fire restored M1919s, the sound echoing like thunder from the past. Each burst feels like history punching through the quiet, like echoes from Bastogne, Guadalcanal, or the Poussin perimeter. For every soldier who cleaned its barrel in a muddy trench, for every loader who fumbled a belt while tracer rounds snapped overhead, for every survivor who remembered the sound of the Browning as the only thing standing between life and death. It wasn't just a machine gun. It was a lifeline, a symbol of steadiness in chaos, the last voice in many desperate fights. And among allies and enemies alike, it earned one thing above all. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.